All right, welcome back. So last time we finished our discussion about Giardia. Now we're going to talk about Trichomonas vaginalis. And this is in a different group of flagellated parasites called the parabacillids. And the disease caused by Trichomonas vaginalis is often just referred to as trichomoniasis. And you'll see this a lot for the different protists. You'll see iasis as the ending to the diseases. So we saw giardiasis, trichomoniasis, and we'll continue to see more of this naming scheme for the diseases. Okay, so Trichomonas vaginalis is it's considered a sexually transmitted disease, which is a little tricky because it's also often a normal flora for a lot of particularly women, but it can also become normal flora of the urethra of men. Um, and what happens is that if you get a disturbance in your normal flora, then it can overgrow. So, for example, if the vaginal pH is disrupted, overgrowth can occur. And this is the same pattern that we saw with uh, Candida albicans, right, the yeast. Um, but in this case, um, it can be, it can have a lot more negative outcomes or complications, right? So this is almost all of the STDs, if not all, women are more susceptible to the infection, and men who do become infected are usually asymptomatic, and so they're considered carriers. Um, and uh, People who do develop symptoms typically are women, but some men can have infection with signs. But for women, it's typically going to be a weird, very foul smelling discharge that can be green or yellow in color. There may or may not be irritation and itching with it, but usually what happens is that all of this is the result of the immune system trying to fight off the parasite. And so there usually will be inflammation, irritation, itching, as well as the discharge. And that discharge is full of your white blood cells trying to fight the infection. Um, it's very common that people with Trichomonas vaginalis infection also have gonorrhea, although um, more people will have Trichomonas vaginalis than they will have gonorrhea. Um, but hopefully you remember when we talked about this for our survey of bacteria that it is quite common, quite a common STD. So this is even Trichomonas vaginalis is even more common of an STD, and it can become very dangerous for pregnant women. It increases your chance of a premature birth, or even if you carry full term, you can have an abnormally low birth weight, which puts the child at great risk of a lot of health issues. Um, the good news is that this is completely curable, but you must treat all sexual partners. So, again, men don't usually have symptoms, but anyone that you have had a sex with will need to also get treated. And also, this is interesting because, and we'll see an image that shows men and women, and so you think it's only uh, transferred from men to women, but it can actually be transmitted from women to women as well, from direct contact, fingers, hands, toys, right? So this um, it's not just for heterosexual intercourse. What else did I want to tell you? I think we're ready to go to the next slide. So if you were looking under a microscope like what we have at school, um, so under oil magnification, It's just one step above what you guys have at home right now. Trichomonas vaginalis would look like this, right? Mostly not quite round, right? It's bigger at one end and kind of tapers off a little bit at the other end. You can see a very dark nucleus, and you can see some flagella. And you see flagella at you'll see more flagella at one end, and then a little flagella at the opposite end. And this, of course, at the bottom is using a scanning electron microscope. So we see great resolution here, and you can see, okay, here's the group of flagella at this end. Here's the undulating membrane, just like we saw before. And then we have this, like the end of the flagella sticking out at the other end. And what it turns out, and this name parabacillid comes from, is that the flagella that you see here actually go through the entire length of the body, and you can kind of see it here, this dark line, and it runs all the way through and then sticks out at the other end. So this is a very peculiar arrangement of flagella, and that's where it gets its name. Most of the organisms, most of the parabacillids are having symbiotic relationships with animals. This happens to be an example of a human pathogen, but we don't see very many human pathogens in this group. So here's the image, and this is to show that men, it can colonize their prostate gland, as well as their urethra. And for women, it can colonize the urethra and the vaginal canal and the cervix. Okay, so this is showing the colonization areas. This is not saying that it's only passed from men to women, right? It can be passed from women to women as well. Down here, we see that I'm not really interested in this image, but here we see the trophozoite divides longitudinally. Again, we saw this before, where it's dividing along the long length of the body in two. So the trophozoite is dividing its fission, right? So what that would look like under a microscope, it looks quite fuzzy here, and it's not as easy to tell, but these are the two groups of flagella at the top, which you would see here, and they're dividing. And then here you see 4 of them. So this is calling this a microcolony. And I think that is about it for this slide. And this image is from the CDC. You'll see a lot of these life cycle images from the CDC. And this is just to reiterate what I've already said. So the trophozoite in the vaginal canal or the prostate of men, the trophozoite can be secreted in vaginal secretions or prostate secretions, and also in the urine if the urethra is being colonized, then you would secrete it in the urine. So depends on the colonization site, and that's where you'll secrete the trophozoite. And then the trophozoite, as I mentioned, will divide by binary fission. So 1 divides into 2. And then the trophozoite is the infectious stage. So this is an interesting life cycle because we're only seeing the trophozoite. We're not seeing cysts. And so there's no known cyst form. And for that reason, it does not survive very well outside of the body. So it's really only transmitted from direct contact because it will not survive in the environment because it's just the trophozoite, no cyst. Okay. And also humans are the only known host. So that means there is potential to eradicate this if we can get this under control. But because so many people have infections with no symptoms, it's unlikely that we will be able to achieve that. All right. So a little bit more about this interesting cell biology. Okay, so you have the oxostyle, which is the microtubules from the flagella that run down the length of the body. And this is used in its motility. Okay, and so the oxostyle actually protrudes out the end and is visible under regular microscopy, as we see here, right? This thick line here. Okay, so that's the opposite end of the flagella. Okay, and then it also has a cytosome, which we learned about before, is like a little mouth, how it's getting its food. And for Trichomonas or for the parabacillids, specialized for phagocytosis. So usually in the form of microtubule or funnel, right, or groove to get the food in. And then food will be directed into a cytosome and sealed into vacuoles. So always whatever it's bringing in from the outside, it's going to keep sealed off in a vacuole, make sure that it doesn't harm itself, right? And again, no cyst form. And the interesting thing we saw with Giardia and we're seeing here with Trichomonas is there's no mitochondria, but they are still performing aerobic respiration. They have other specialized organelles instead. And so in this case, there's hydrogensomes for energy production. And even though in this image, the nucleus looks very round, it's usually more elongated. And I think you can see that here, right? So it looks almost like that circle has been squished a little bit. So it's more flat on one side. Another thing about the parabacillids and Trichomonas specifically is this, the fifth flagellum wraps back around the body and creates the undulating membrane. And we're not really sure what the purpose of that is, like exactly how this benefits the organism, but we do see this pattern in a lot of these parasites having these undulating membranes. And just recall that what the undulating membrane means is that a flagella is wrapping along the edge of that. So the flagella wraps backwards along the surface of the cell's plasma membrane, forming an undulating membrane. And so this can move and flap around. And these guys, as you probably guess, are really good swimmers. All right, Euglena. So there's a group called Euglenozoa, and they're usually photoautotrophs, and they would usually have that green pigment, and they're non-pathogenic. In the case of Trypanosoma, we have lost our photosynthetic ability, we've lost our pigment, and now we're an obligate parasite. And Trypanosoma is actually a blood parasite. So we call it a hemoflagellate. It does have a flagella at one end, you can see here. And this is also a scanning electron microscopy image. And you can also see a little bit of an undulating membrane here. And then the end of the flagella here. And you can see this red blood cell. And so the Trypanosoma typically will be in the blood, reproducing in the blood, but not necessarily inside of the red blood cell. There are two main species, and you'll see that there's actually subspecies. So most of the time we only have a genus and species name, but with Trypanosoma, we actually have the third name. And so Trypanosoma brucei gamians and Trypanosoma brucei rhodescens. And these are important to distinguish because we notice that the gamian strain tends to cause chronic infections, whereas the other tends to form acute, so very fast infections. Also, interestingly, they tend to be the chronic strain is associated with West Africa. It's not limited, but it is more common in West Africa, whereas the acute form is more in the East Africa. We also have an American trypanosoma, which we'll see next. Okay, so the symptoms will be the same, but the duration will be different. Okay, so the vector for both of these is the tsetse fly, which I forgot to put an image of, but you could look that up easily just to see what it looks like. There will be intermittent or recurrent fevers, headaches, swollen lymph nodes, and wherever the fly has bitten the individual, it will probably be itchy. Once the trypanosoma is in the blood or the lymphatic system, it will start undergoing rapid division, and it does this through the schizogony. Remember, that's one cell dividing into multiple cells. It will then cross the blood-brain barrier and can cause meningitis and encephalitis, and that's where you get the more severe symptoms like changes in behavior, disrupted senses like taste, smell, right? Loss of balance, confusion, and its most characteristic symptom is the changes in the sleep cycle. So extreme awakeness at night and extreme sleepiness at night, but not like not necessarily the entire night and the entire day switched, but just interruptions, right? Periods of this awakeness. And another complication is that it can affect the heart. And so most of the deaths caused by trypanosoma are actually due to that heart complication, and the encephalitis as well. Now, this, if it's not treated, it is almost always fatal. Now, the American trypanosoma is cruzi, Trypanosoma cruzi, and we call this Chagas disease, or like I said, American trypanosoma. Now, the vector for this strain of trypanosoma is the kissing bug, and they call it the kissing bug because it tends to bite people near the lips. So they act as though, you know, they call it the kissing bug as if the bug is trying to kiss them. But it's not very nice because it's actually biting them. And then if it has defecated, the feces can get into the bite wound and then cause the infection. So the bug itself is infected with the parasite. It secretes the parasite in its feces. And when it bites you, if the feces get in the wound, such as like rubbing it, right? So you get bitten, you slap it, you rub it, whatever, and then you basically move the feces into the wound. And so then the parasite in the feces will then get inside of the skin, and this can also lead to acute or chronic. Not every person will develop the chronic stage, but a lot will. So the acute phase is fever, and you can have a mild enlargement of the liver and spleen, and the liver will typically be more enlarged than the spleen will be. And the lymph nodes may or may not also be swollen. If an individual was bitten around the eye, like the eyelid, or they got rubbed the feces into their eye, then they could also have this a distinguishing symptom of the swelling of the eyelid. So sometimes young children will have such severe inflammatory response to this infection, and also the heart muscle and or the brain can become severely inflamed as well, that it will cause death during this acute phase. But typically, for the majority of infections will survive the acute phase, and some point later in life develop the chronic phase unless they received treatment and were cured from the parasite. And one of the reasons that this acute phase is important to receive treatment during is because the extracellular activity that we see here is only during certain periods of the acute phase. So you would only be able to treat during this time. You also will only be able to diagnose during this time, and you have a short window to be able to catch this. And these are also red blood cells like we saw on this image. But this is what it would look like under oil magnification in the lab. Okay. And this would be someone really good, got a really, really good image. You and I in the lab wouldn't quite see all of this detail, but enough to, you see like a squiggly a parasite outside of red blood cells, and your first thought will be trypanosoma, especially with this dark nucleus at the narrow end. All right. So the chronic phase, this can last decades, even the entire lifespan of a person, and they don't even necessarily have symptoms. About 25% of individuals will develop the actual symptoms, and they're characterized as two sets of symptoms. You have the cardiac complications and the gastrointestinal complications, and they may have one or the other or both. Okay, so they didn't clear the parasite. It's been slowly growing right inside of them, and it can infect the heart and cause the heart to continually enlarge. It could lead to heart attacks, sudden arrest, right? Sudden death. It can lead to a slower issue of heart failure where they, they're not able to get enough blood and throughout the body to meet demand, so they're constantly out of breath, for example. They could just have an altered heart rhythm or rate, and about 40% of these chronic cases will result in death because of this damage to the heart. For gastrointestinal complications, individuals can usually survive, but it's very debilitating. And so what can happen is if the esophagus has been colonized, it can lead to what we call mega esophagus, this very, very big enlargement. And this can also happen to the colon. What do the esophagus and the colon have in common? Peristalsis, right? Those muscle contractions that keep all of your food moving all the way through and out of the body. And so those muscles become defective, and you get this enlargement. And so it could be just the esophagus, just the colon, or both. Of course, this is going to interfere with your ability to eat and to defecate. And so that's why it's going to be very debilitating. And as I mentioned, the treatment of the chronic phase is not effective because the parasite is going to then be intracellular. And at that point, the drugs are not going to be able to reach it. Not to mention that the drugs are actually very nasty, have very nasty side effects. So this is very difficult to treat. This is most common in Central and South America. And I don't know if I wrote that anywhere. Yeah, Latin America. Okay. Now, another euglenozoa parasite that we should talk about is Lesion Mania. And sometimes the disease is called leishmaniasis, right? And this time the vector is an infected female sandfly. And of course, I haven't specified infected on these previous slides, but so far, everything we've talked about, the vector is actually infected, and part of the life cycle of the parasite is taking place in the vector. And so here you have the sandfly, and it bites. And Leishmania is an obligate intracellular parasite. So the entire disease pathology will take place inside of a cell. This is most common in tropics and subtropics. There's about 21 different species, so that's why I'm not telling you any species name. We're just calling it Leishmania. And it doesn't really matter the specific species because they will all cause the same disease in humans, and we can treat it just the same. So it actually will reproduce in phagocytes. So phagocytes try to, they'll engulf the parasite, try to get rid of it, but then it will actually multiply, reproduce in the phagocyte. The parasite, the host, and other factors like environmental factors will determine whether the infection becomes symptomatic or not, if it's cutaneous or if it's visceral. So that's very interesting. We haven't seen that yet in class, but now we're seeing there's a lot of different factors that will determine whether the bite from this infected sandfly will result in cutaneous or visceral, with or without symptoms. Cutaneous, you will have at least one bite, but you could have several bites from sandflies, right? So one or more sores. The sore is a result of the bite and the parasite. It will cause this somewhat volcano-shaped sore where the edges are raised up, and then there's like a crater in the middle. A scab may or may not form. You'll see sometimes you'll see it, sometimes you won't. And for some people it'll be painful, and for others it's painless. And that's quite a surprising variation, but that's one of those factors that determine whether it's symptomatic. And one of those symptoms would be pain or no pain. So if this is happening somewhere you're not able to see and it doesn't hurt, then you won't even know, right? Some people will also have some swollen glands, but nothing too concerning, right? If it, instead of it staying in the skin, if it moves and becomes visceral, then you can have a fever, weight loss, enlarged spleen and liver, and you may or may not have swollen glands. So I'm not going to ask you to memorize all these steps, but I did want to show it to you for a couple of reasons, because this is a global big issue. But also I wanted you to get a feel for seeing that these different parasites can have a very involved life cycles where you see one form happening in the vector, and you see another form of the life cycle taking place in the human. So here, what you focus on is that the sandfly is infected, right? It has lots and lots of the parasite, and it bites a person, and it's biting a person to take a blood meal, just like you would see like a mosquito, right? And when it does that, now the parasite has been transferred. It was in the saliva, and now it's been transferred to the person. And macrophages try to get rid of this parasite, but then the parasite's able to survive and multiply. And we see that then, now that it's multiplied in this individual, if another sandfly comes and bites this individual, it can become infected, and then the other part of the life cycle will occur in that sandfly, and this cycle repeats. Okay, but again, you do not need to memorize all the details and all the specific names of this life cycle. Okay, amoeba. Everyone likes amoebas, right? So this is a friendly amoeba, Amoeba proteus. It does not cause any disease, does not bother us. It's a good example to look at in the lab. We normally have slides of these that you would look at. This is how you learn about pseudopods, right? These extensions. So the way that amoeba move or get from one place to another is by extending these projections of their cytoplasm and then moving. So it extends this projection, and then the rest of the body can then be pulled towards it, and it can move, and they can move quite quickly, more quickly than you would think with this type of movement. This is also how it will engulf food, and of course it will, once it brings that inside, it will be kept inside a vacuole, right? So we'll see lots of food vacuoles in an amoeba, but the largest and darkest structure, which could be located in different areas because amoebas are constantly changing their shape, but the biggest and darkest structure you see should be the nucleus. And that's kind of all. I'm not going to go into any more detail with its cell biology here. We'll see free-living aquatic amoeba as well as non. For as far as thinking about human pathogens, there are some free-living aquatic amoebas that, for example, a kid jumps into a lake, gets water up his nose, and then ends up having a brain, a brain infection and abscess forming from that amoeba. It's not transmitted person to person in that case, right? Much more commonly, and also the only human intestinal pathogen in the whole group of amoeba, is called Entamoeba histolytica. And it's surprising, it's the only human intestinal pathogen of amoeba, but it's incredibly common. About 1 in every 10 people will have had an infection with Entamoeba histolytica at one point. So you can assume then most people don't have symptoms. So how is this being transmitted? So this organism does have a cyst form, which we see here. This is the cyst. It has an extra protective layer so that it can survive outside of the host. And then you have what we call the vegetative form, the trophozoite. And I know I called that the center. This image used to be longer and I cropped it. So on the right-hand side is the trophozoite, and the left-hand side is the cyst. Down below is the trophozoite acting as an amoeba, changing shape, engulfing, and inside you see that it's engulfed red blood cells. So it is eating the host. And this is what causes the bloody stool, the dysentery. So the disease caused by Entamoeba histolytica is called, sometimes it's just called amoebasis, like an amoeba, but more commonly, I think you'll see it called amoebic dysentery. I like that name better. It tells you more about what's happening, right? Dysentery is bloody stool that typically also will have mucus in it because of the damage. Excuse me. The damage done to cause the bleeding will also typically lead to extra mucus production. That's just a defensive response. And of course, all that going on, you're likely to have a lot of stomach pain or cramps. This specifically does have a high mortality rate due to if the amoeba gets through the intestinal wall or weakens the intestinal wall enough for it to open up, then it's very hard to treat that kind of sepsis. And so that's where the high mortality rate comes from for Entamoeba histolytica. Sometimes an abscess will form if the amoeba has traveled to the liver. Very rarely does it travel to the lungs or brain, but it has happened. But for the most part, it's staying in the intestine, and the biggest complication is that perforation of the intestinal wall. With that said, so we say only 15% of infected individuals actually become sick, but when you have 1 out of every 10 people worldwide becoming infected, that's a large amount of people getting sick, right? So transmission is fecal-oral route, specifically of the cyst. The trophozoite's going to die pretty quickly once it's outside of the body, but the cyst is going to survive, right? And it's usually the large intestine where the infection takes place, which, the large intestine is also called the colon, right? Okay. Now, another group of protozoa are called Apocomplexa. So the Apocomplexa group get this name from having like an apex or a tip, and they also have specialized organelles that we don't see in other organisms. So the presence of complex special organelles and at the apex of their cell is where they get their name from. These are the first ones we've seen that are non-motile. So these are not flagellated, right? There's no flagella. They also don't have cilia either, right? No motility. They're also obligate intracellular parasites. They can have very complex life cycles. And there's a few very significant, really important parasites in this group. One of which is Cryptosporidium. It's a big problem because it's very resistant to chlorination, and so it can survive our water treatment and be in our water supply. So you could be drinking this. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It'll be in your drinking water. It'll be in your recreational water. Lots of animals can be infected with Cryptosporidium, and then their feces will contaminate the water, and that's typically how it's spread from animal to people. But people who are infected can also transmit it. So fecal oral route, animal or people. It causes a severe diarrhea. I say severe because it's watery. And remember that that means more rapid dehydration and more risk of death from dehydration. Another thing to know is that AIDS patients will die if they have a cryptosporidium infection. It's very rare that we're able to treat the infection and save the patient. We might be able to delay it a few months. That's typically the best that we can do. So that's another reason that we need to talk about it, because it's especially life-threatening to AIDS patients, and it could be it can easily be present in their drinking water. So what would you do then in that situation? You would probably suggest that they only drink reverse osmosis water, which is an ultra filtration where it's just very, very, very pure. It's the purest water that we can have is reverse osmosis. And that's really the only way to ensure that it's safe, because the chlorination is not a guarantee. These oocysts that you see here will lead to the release of lots of parasites once it's inside the body. And just like we saw with cysts, the oocysts are protected by an outer shell and allowed to survive for a long time outside of the host. So even though it's an obligate intracellular parasite, it can survive in the oocyst until it's ingested by an animal or a person. So that's it for cryptosporidium. Now we want to talk about Plasmodium. Plasmodium causes malaria. There are several species of Plasmodium, and your book does actually talk to you about a few. I decided to try to keep it a little bit more simple, because I want to focus more on some other aspects. Okay, so malaria is an actual red blood cell infection. So these are very tiny parasites that are part of their life cycle is taking place inside of the red blood cells. And so you can see almost all of these red blood cells are infected. So all of these really dark purple spots, that's the Plasmodium protozoa parasite, right? So this red blood cell is not infected. This one's not infected. Here we see the parasite outside of a red blood cell. It's probably about to go infect another cell. We call this part, and this is where we can best diagnose someone with malaria. We call it the ring stage, and you'll notice that you'll get this kind of ring-like structure between like two dark spots of the parasite, and you might even see it more than once in a red blood cell. This one's 3 times, right? And then some only once, okay? But it's called the ring stage, and this is what you would see under oil magnification if you were in person in the lab. Of course, this image is not a true image. This is somebody has done modeling or some type of art to demonstrate this. But this is showing what we see here, right? This ring stage within the red blood cell. Children and pregnant women are the most vulnerable to malaria and serious malaria infections. So what is it? Malaria will cause these 2 to 3 day bouts of fever, and the fever is very extreme. It's high fever, severe, moderate to severe shaking, chills, right? Often pretty severe headache will come with that fever, and the person may even experience vomiting. As soon as that high fever breaks, they're going to have extreme sweating as their body temperature tries to adjust back to normal, right? Cool off. What can happen well, imagine all this damage to red blood cells. You can become anemic. If the infection spreads to the liver, and then the liver becomes compromised, the person can experience jaundice, which we're used to thinking of jaundice as a yellowing of the skin, but that's an outward sign is the skin or the whites of your eyes become yellow. That tells you that you have a liver problem, right? And so in this case, it would be infection. It can also spread to the kidneys and completely destroy them and cause kidney failure. Some people, it can cause seizures, mental confusion, coma, and death. Most of the deaths from malaria are not what you would think. You would think it'd be from the anemia, but it's actually an unusual complication. I mean, I don't want to say unusual. It's not unusual to malaria, but it's unusual as far as I haven't seen this happen with any of the other diseases that I've studied. So the red blood cells can, instead of just being destroyed, they could develop these, what I would say, surface knobs that allow it to stick to capillary walls, and you don't want that. So if enough of that happens, your capillary wall can be or your capillary can become completely clogged, and you no longer get that blood flow that you need. And so this clogging can then cause extreme organ damage and death. Right. So if your organs are not able to get enough blood because all the capillaries are clogged with these defective red blood cells, right? So that's going to lead to organ failure and death. So that's a complication of malaria, and it happens a lot. This malaria is very deadly, and this is why. Okay. Of course, this is happening most often in poor regions, tropical, subtropic areas, such as sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where poverty is quite high. So people might know that they have malaria, but they cannot get treatment. There's nothing they can do about it. Furthermore, the only way to really prevent malaria is to protect your skin so that you don't get bitten. We used to have drugs that we said were, you could take to prevent malaria, but now the Plasmodium parasite is resistant to it. So you may have heard of like tonic water contains quinoline at low levels, and if you take it at very high doses, it can prevent or treat malaria. But it's now you'd be hard pressed to find Plasmodium that's not resistant, right? They're almost all the Plasmodium strains are resistant now. So now you would need to have more expensive drugs, and with those come also some serious side effects. So really what we tell people is the best way to protect yourself is good protection from getting bitten. So you could use repellent sprays. You can use long clothing to cover your skin, prevent yourself from getting bitten. Bed nets, so while you sleep, you're not getting bitten, right? The specific mosquito that transmits Plasmodium is called the Anopheles. The Anopheles is the genus name. There are a few species of Anopheles that can transmit malaria. So the mosquito becomes infected from gametocytes that it accidentally got when it was feeding on another person or animal. So blood meal it gets these gametocytes, parasites. And then about a week later, when it goes to get more blood from, people or animals, it now can transmit the Plasmodium. So sporozoites will immediately travel to the liver of the individual who's been bitten. Okay. And then that will undergo rapid division, right? Schizogony, one cell dividing into multiple cells. And that's going to release a type of the life cycle called merozoites. And those are found in the blood. And that's that ring stage. So these are the merozoites, the ring stage. Okay, those will continue to infect red blood cells and repeat this cycle, but some of the merozoites will actually develop into male and female gametocytes, which then, if the person gets bitten, can then spread the infection to another vector and continue to spread it that way. It's not very common, but you can also transmit this through needles, right? If someone has the parasite in their blood, and then you get a needle stick with that same needle, it's possible. Blood transfusions, of course, not here in the US, but in other countries, this can still happen, as well as organ donations, but that would be the least common, right? And not uncommon, congenital. So from mother to child, typically before birth, but can actually happen during delivery. We never see sexual transmission. We're really not people to people, except for these exceptions like mother to child. Okay. So 300 million people approximately become infected every year, and about 500,000 people die. So this is a global crisis, right? And that's why you've probably heard of malaria before. You might not have known very much about it other than that it's spread by mosquitoes. Because it's already affecting poverty-stricken areas, it makes it very, very difficult for these communities to ever get out of poverty. It continues this vicious cycle of disease and poverty. And this is what we see with a lot of the parasites and a lot of the diseases that we've studied in class. If it's not a disease that's endemic to the United States, then typically we're going to see this problem, this cycle. We'll see that the vast majority of the deaths are occurring in children, and most of those children are in Africa. So very sad. So as I said, avoid being bitten, use your bed nets. The bed nets can be impregnated with insecticide to really repel the bugs. You should not go out during dusk or dawn. That's when mosquitoes are most active. They're going to be swarming. If you have to go out, you should definitely be wearing long clothing, and hopefully also have some insecticide on the clothing to prevent getting bitten. Intermittent preventative treatment of pregnant women occurs in endemic areas. So you've probably heard of malaria or anti-malaria campaigns, where organizations get funding and resources to go to these areas and provide this treatment. It helps, but it obviously is still a major problem, right? Mosquito control efforts have failed greatly in these endemic areas, but it was effective in the United States. We did have malaria outbreaks, and now we never really hear about malaria outbreaks in the United States. There's actually a lot that could be said about that, but we don't have time for that. Diagnosis, as I mentioned, you would need to have that ring stage detection. That's the best way to diagnose. I'm not talking about treatment because it is very also tricky, it's difficult. There's a lot of resistance, and so there's a lot of different new drugs and side effects and things. So if you're interested, please read about it. Your book has a little bit about it, and of course the CDC will have a lot of information for you. But I mostly wanted to focus on prevention. That's our best hope for getting malaria under control, is educating and providing resources for people to prevent getting bitten, and dealing and helping pregnant women so that we can stop congenital spread. Okay. Our last member of our Apocomplexa group is Toxoplasma. And you may have heard of Toxoplasma because people have talked about pregnant women not being around cats. Now, that's true and not true. So cats are the primary host. And if a cat becomes infected and someone comes in contact with that cat or anything that has the feces from the cat, that person can then be infected. This is incredibly common. And so most people will have already had a Toxoplasma infection, and it's no problem. It's a problem when you become infected for the first time and you are pregnant, or you become pregnant soon after, and the parasite is still in the blood, and then that can infect the newborn. It can cause death to the newborn, or I'm sorry, death to the fetus. So you can have stillborn, you can have miscarriage, or you deliver, but the baby at some point in time has a central nervous system damage or damage to the eyes. A lot of the times the babies that are delivered with Toxoplasma infections don't necessarily show any signs or symptoms right away, but it develops as the baby develops. So that's a concern. So women, that one of the things that you should be tested for when you are thinking about becoming pregnant, or you find that you are pregnant, is to see if you have any antibodies for toxo. You can also test to see if you suspect a Toxoplasma infection, then you can be tested for that as well. And then you would just take precautions. Another thing you could do is, if your cat is only indoors, then you would make sure that somebody else is taking care of the litter box, and that whenever you pet your cat, you wash your hands, right? So you can take precautions. You don't have to get rid of your cat. So Toxoplasma is interesting because it falls statistically as the leading cause of death attributed to foodborne illness in the United States. And that's kind of misleading. So what happens is you do ingest the cyst, and that's how the infection occurs. And it can happen from eating undercooked meat, and the meat has tissue cysts. And this is most common in pork and lamb. But you could, if the drinking water has become contaminated with feces from an infected animal, then that you could get it that way as well. And then, as I had mentioned already, exposure from an infected cat feces. And cats will secrete an oocyst in their feces, and after a few days, the oocyst will sporulate, and then that's when it's infectious. And then we talked about pregnant women. If it's their first infection, can the vegetative form, the tachyzoid can get to, it's in the blood, and it can get to the unborn child and infect it. Okay. Symptoms, if you experience symptoms, which most people don't, it could be muscle pain, fever, headache, swollen glands. Normal, healthy people will clear this infection, no problem. Most people never even know they've had the infection. But if you're immunocompromised, then it can be fatal. And one of the reasons that it can be fatal is that it can cross into the central nervous system. Person receives treatment, it kills the free tachyzoids, but it doesn't kill the cysts, the tissue cysts that form. And then those tissue cysts can reopen later on and cause a massive, like a reinfection in a sense, like an outbreak. It can cause lots of swelling in the brain and a lot of tissue damage. So Toxoplasma we're mostly concerned about pregnant women because the damage and or death to the unborn child, and then the immunocompromised, because it is almost always fatal for immunocompromised individuals. So this is from the CDC, and I just made an addition. Cats can spread it to other cats, and that wasn't represented here in this diagram. So I wanted to just put these arrows when an infected cat can, in the feces, spread it to other cats. So if the cat ingests infected animal, which could also include a bird, which is not shown here, and that's, mice and birds are the most common source other than other cats. And so the cat ingests a tissue cyst. If it's from a bird or a mouse, it might ingest an oocyst if it's from another cat. And then it becomes infected. The cats are the definitive host. This is where the sexual life cycle takes place. Once it defecates, you have the fecal oocysts, and they will sporulate about 1 to 5 days after defecation. And the cats will continue to shed large amounts of oocysts in their feces anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks after infection. And then they typically will clear the infection and they'll be fine. Animals or people ingest sporulated oocysts from this cat and become infected. For you and me, the most likely would be from cleaning a litter box, but you can, contaminated soil or water can happen as well. Or the other most common cause of people becoming infected is eating the intermittent host that has a tissue cyst, as pigs, lambs, or venison, right? And I guess these are common not only as an intermediate host, but for people to eat undercooked meat of these types. I can't tell you too much about that because I'm a vegetarian. Cysts transform into tachyzoids very quickly after ingestion and can then cause neural and muscle get into the neural and muscle tissue and then produce cysts. And so that's why for immune compromised individuals, it's very difficult. Their immune system's not really able to get this under control because the cysts will survive and then they can release more of the tachyzoites, and the cycle continues. Okay. Now, finally, to the ciliates. And the ciliates are nice because you know from the name that they have cilia. And typically they'll be surrounded in cilia, but there are a few examples where cilia are only in a particular location. But either way, they have cilia. Okay. They have a macronucleus and a micronucleus, which is interesting, right? So the macronucleus will be involved with things like protein synthesis, right? So transcription and some other cellular activities. Whereas the micronucleus is specifically only for the sexual reproduction part of its life cycle. We'll see they also have a cytosome or mouth, right, to bring in food. The cilia sweep the food inside, and then it will be contained in a food vacuole, right? They also have an interesting contractile vacuole, which allows them to float or sink as they're usually in water. Okay. And we see they're considered a complex cell. Okay. What we're looking at right here is a paramecium, and they are non-pathogenic. But there's an important pathogen called Plasmodium coli. It is the only known parasitic ciliate to humans. There's plenty that can infect animals. But for humans, we are only concerned about Plasmodium coli. Please take care to remember that this is a protozoan, right? It's very easy to confuse it as bacteria because it ends with coli. Coli for colon, it's infecting the colon, okay? It can lead to dysentery, and it's going to be the fecal oral route, so fecal contamination of drinking water. And the primary reservoir are swine. And a very characteristic feature of B. coli is this is the cyst of B. coli. This is what is infectious, and it has a distinctive kidney-shaped nucleus. So the macronucleus will be kind of a kidney shape. Okay, so when you look at a fecal smear and you see this, you would know Plasmodium coli. So a little bit more about ciliates. They reproduce by conjugation, and so you'll see when you see two of them together real close like this, you know that conjugation is taking place. Also, some cilia or ciliates they have a stalk that they can use to attach to objects, and it'll be like a spring-like mechanism to expand it and retract it. And this is allowing, this is a non-pathogenic ciliate that is eating food from an area kind of far away from it, right? And we also see that cilia are surrounding its cytosome to sweep food in to its little mouth as well. But it's not covered in cilia like we saw with the paramecium. So there you go. There's a little bit about the ciliates, and your only concern is pathogen-wise is Plasmodium coli. And that is the end. Good job. Go study and memorize these 8 protozoan pathogens. Bye.